Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night, 7:11 p.m. Central, and we're all kicking it live. And Jay's here tonight, Jay McNicholas.
How's it going, Jeff?
It's going great, sort of, not really. And William Snider, a.k.a. Recluse, is here for his book, The Minotaur, a Kubrick Odyssey. And this is the third time, I believe, isn't it? Yeah, it's the third.
Yeah, I believe it is third time.
And definitely looking forward to this discussion. And one thing I want to say, I'm so sick of seeing this little Putin shit talking about he's going to drop a bomb. It's like, just do it. Shut up. It's like, God, like everything I see is like an article about him.
We need to see if he actually attempts it, and then if Elon Musk stays true to his word and tries to intercept it with the satellites, that would be an interesting.
Like, just do it, you little troll gnome. I'm sick of hearing it. I'm like dying from stress from bills, so just go ahead, you asshole. But yeah. But anyway, it's great to have you back, and I love Stanley Kubrick. I mean, I remember seeing The Shining when I was young, and the Space Odyssey movies, and I've seen everything of his. I don't think I've seen that weird Lolita one though. I don't think I ever saw that. Like, I never made it to that one. Maybe one year, maybe not. But I've seen all of his stuff except that, I think. But it's great to have you here. I know it's a very controversial subject. I see all kinds of stuff in the alt media about him and the moon landing and all this crap and all that stuff. There's just so many different layers to it. But what made you tackle this time around?
Well, I mean, Stanley Kubrick is my all-time favorite director, and even though I hadn't really published a lot of material on Kubrick, I've actually been compiling information on him for quite a few years. I mean, this really went all the way back to when I was in high school, when I started kind of formally getting a lot of Kubrick bios and stuff. I was actually probably one of the people that cried when Stanley Kubrick died in 1999, actually. Saw Eyes Wide Shut at the theaters. But what really spurred me into writing this book actually was Jason Horsley's book on Kubrick, the Kubrickon, which I had actually provided some of the research for, specifically with the stuff related to semiomatics. And Jason had gone in a really interesting direction for this. For those of you unaware, Jason is not a Kubrick fan. In fact, he rather despises Stanley Kubrick and his movies. But I will say it was an extremely well-written and well-argued book. And I was really captivated by it. And I felt like there were some things that Jason just didn't go far enough. So that was partly what inspired me to write this, and just also because I felt like Kubrick really deserved something that was a semi-scholarly work that had actually been written by somebody who was a fan. Because that was the other thing I got to say with Jason. I mean, his research on Kubrick really blew a lot of the stuff that had been done by the Kubrick conspiracy researchers out of the water. I mean, it was well-sourced. A lot of great material in there. So that was kind of the other thing, is I wanted to do something where it's like there's going to be actual documentation in this, other than, I've watched Room 237 37 times or something like that. And, yeah. I've come to this revelation or something about it, because to me, this is one of the big issues with Kubrick research, is people really just don't try to understand the man, and they go strictly by what is in the movies. And to me, that's a major mistake, because he's so ambiguous with his films. They're so opaque.
Well, my question is, what made him? What are some things that he didn't like about him? I mean, every movie I've ever seen of his, I've enjoyed. I've never been like, I don't like Stanley Kubrick. Oh, what made him not like him?
Well, I know one thing that Jason and I have kind of an ongoing dispute with is the acting in Kubrick's films, which Jason would classify as being bad. I would say that it was unusual. And I think, again, in this case, I totally get where he's coming from, but I feel like you have to judge the performance on the basis of what Kubrick was trying to get out of it. And it's obvious if you've watched any one of his movies, later movies through it especially, he wasn't interested in naturalistic performances. This isn't method acting or anything like that. In fact, I mean, I think he deliberately tried through the editing process to create, in a lot of ways, just the strangest, most bizarre performances that he could possibly get, which was done in a lot of cases, I think for psychological reasons in terms of the audience. I mean, one thing you can kind of point out is the really famous, the crazy Kubrick stare. So like, that's something, it's been psychologically proving that look is very unsettling to human beings when you see it. I mean, if you just want to freak people out at the supermarket and stuff, just go around and like smile at them like that. They'll be terrified of you in about 2 seconds.
I don't know if I've seen it. Is there pictures of him doing the look?
But it's just one of those things, like, this is something that Kubrick is doing because he's not trying to get a naturalistic performance out of his actors, but he's trying to do a psychological trick on the audience. So for me, I would judge the performance on what his intention was, but I can get where Jason's coming from in terms of being a movie fan and looking at this for an actual performance. It's not going to hold up to, I don't know, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something that got a bunch of Oscars that is currently escaping my mind at the moment right now. I mean, it's not, the type of movie I guess Robert De Niro would have typically done in his heyday or something like that. But that was one of the issues that Jason had. Another issue, which, I mean, a lot of people will bring up with Kubrick, is the general iciness of his films, the fact that they seem to really be missing the human touch, which ironically was something that I've really come to reject the more I've watched Kubrick's films over the years and the more that I learned about him as a person. I actually kind of came to the conclusion that his movies are really quite emotional, but he did such a masterful job of covering that up that it's easy for that to go over the audience's head when they're watching the films. But again, I could definitely see all of Jason's arguments. I think he's also as frustrated with the Kubrick fans as he is with the director, because there's this tendency to put Kubrick on a pedestal and act that he's not open to criticism, or that his motives may not have been as pure for some of his films as people like to think. Because, I mean, there's sort of this perception that Kubrick was this consummate artist. That was all he cared about, was his art. And no doubt he was passionate about it, but Kubrick definitely liked to make money. And he very much made films on the basis of financial considerations. This is, one of the things that I was really interested in doing a lot of research into Kubrick the man. But this is the type of stuff, like a lot of conventional Kubrick fans, like, they don't want to hear that in some ways he probably even more obsessed, frankly, with the box office than a guy like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas. In fact, he had kind of a perpetual case of, I guess you would say, almost box office envy with Spielberg and Lucas, because they were able to do these, hugely successful films like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and he was never able to quite produce something that brought in that kind of coin for the studios.
Well,
so
he did a lot of edgy stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of, how do you do? I mean, nowadays there's a lot of edgy stuff, like the Saw movies, I suppose. Not that they compare to a Kubrick movie, but it's just saucy material.
Well, that was a big struggle for Kubrick, because he also was aware of the expectations that his fans had. And that was kind of his ongoing thing, I think, from the late 70s onwards, is how did he do a Stanley Kubrick movie that would remain up to the standards that people were expecting from a Stanley Kubrick movie, but had that crossover appeal to rake in the dough. I mean, that's why he spent decades working on AI, because he kind of envisioned that as being his version of E.T., this reimagining of the Pinocchio theme. But it was just so hard for him to try to come up with a way to do that movie to where it would have brought in that kind of money, which is why towards the end of his life, he had already made the decision that it would be better if Steven Spielberg directed it, because he kind of had to come to the conclusion that he just wasn't going to be able to make something like that would have family appeal the way that
Which
Spielberg
movie
did.
was it? Which movie?
AI, artificial intelligence.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I know I've always seen the Stephen King controversy with The Shining. I like The Shining movie, but I mean, I can understand, people being upset if they go from the storyline in the book and stuff like that. But I've always loved The Shining. It's definitely haunting. It's very haunting.
Well, I think there was a lot more to the controversy they've led on. Because first off, like, the whole thing with like King criticizing Kubrick for changing his book. It's like, come on. I mean, you guys have seen The Lawnmower Man, right? I mean, this has absolutely nothing in common with the freaking short story. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Stephen King, especially in the 80s, he sold the rights to a ton of his freaking projects. And they kept almost nothing but the freaking title, essentially, and the whole, crucial adapted from a Stephen King novel or something like that. So I don't buy that King was that butthurt over Kubrick changing the storyline. And even on top of that, it's not like the changes that he made were really that dramatic. I mean, the big one was the change at the end where you have the hedge maze instead of the hedge animals that come to life. And even in that case, Kubrick actually had a reasonable explanation for that, i.e., that the special effects at the time wouldn't be able to make that believable. Even though, just my opinion, there's no freaking way Stanley Kubrick is putting a walking hedge animal in his movie. That's
yeah, living topiary. I mean, come on.
It's not happening. But regardless, I think a lot of it cuts the fact that Kubrick was, in my opinion, bullied into making The Shining, because he was coming off of Barry Lyndon, and that was by far the biggest box office failure of his career. The budget on that had ballooned, and it just was terrible at the US box office. It did okay in Europe, but it was awful in the United States. And the movie that Warner Brothers had really, really wanted Kubrick to direct as the follow-up to Clockwork Orange was The Exorcist, which he passed on. And they were still pretty sore about that after Barry Lyndon. They had actually tried to get Kubrick to direct the second Exorcist movie, which he wanted no part of. And then it kind of seems like they roped him into doing The Shining. He essentially agreed to adapt it even before the book had been properly released. And if you sort of go back and look at some of the interviews, it's interesting how Kubrick chooses to praise King. He goes on and on a lot about the qualities of his storylines, but at a few points he kind of slips up and essentially acknowledges that the writing and the characterization is mediocre. So I think going into this, Kubrick was really resentful because he's Stanley Kubrick. You know, he turned Arthur C. Clarke into a serious author for science fiction when he did 2001. So in a lot of ways, he's basically being asked to do the same thing for Stephen King, put the proverbial crown on his head. And I think based on what he found in the novel, he was deeply insulted by that. And he really wanted Stephen King to know that, which is why there are certain elements of King's work he really seemed to have deliberately played up, most notably the innate racism occasionally that crops up in terms of African-American characters. Because if you go back and see how he did Halloran, Kubrick did Halloran in The Shining, I mean, it's almost like something out of blackface. It's practically comical. He goes through this dramatic journey from Florida to get to the Overlook to save Danny and Wendy. And then literally within like a minute of walking in the hotel, he gets an axe in the chest. I mean, in the novel, he actually plays a pretty big role in like saving them, but like it's almost like Keystone Cops. He shows up and gets killed. And then you have that whole scene in the red bathroom with the dialogue that was literally taken line from the novel, where he's talking to Grady and he's like, you know, your son is invited in Cook. And he's like, I mean, it's just, you know, he's basically got Nicholson playing this as like the most inbred, like redneck fashion you could really imagine that scene playing in. And I think that was the reason why King really got steam with this, because I almost imagine Kubrick playing this for the Warner Brothers executives with that scene and just like, look at this, just look at this shit. This is what you gave me to work with. So.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. I guess Jay blacked out, but
I had to let the kitty cat out.
And I've seen you know, all that controversy and just wondered about it on so many different levels.
Well, I got another avenue on that. You say King was upset about the movie Kubrick made. I don't know what Anthony Burgess's reaction was to A Clockwork Orange, but I studied the book in high school, A Clockwork Orange, the actual book. But because of my dyslexia, it was so hard for me to read. I mean, that's the words they use, what is it, Eurospeak or whatever, that bruised and groovy rookers and whatnot. It threw my dyslexia for a loop. So I had the hardest time. And this was 9th grade, high school, by the way. We were reading this book. So my mom went the extra mile and said, we're just going to rent the movie and you and I will watch it. And so I watched A Clockwork Orange, which is...
That'd be an awkward movie to watch with your parents.
It kind of was. You know, I was fine. What was I, 13, 14, 15 years old? I don't remember. but the movie borders on pornographic issues. I mean, there are some almost very pornographic scenes in it. It's one of the few R-rated movies where you see male genitalia, and I'm watching it with my mom so I can get an A in the class. But the book and the movie are very, very close. I mean, Kubrick had, for time reasons, he changed a few things. He, like, one character he completely edits out, but in my opinion, he did almost a bang-up job doing. The only thing he didn't do was the final chapter, which I didn't know about till later on. The American books only had 20 chapters. The actual original book had 21, and the 21st chapter, I'm not going to spoil the book for anyone, is kind of like the epilogue. It's a good ending to the story, but it's a messed up story. So I wonder what Anthony Burgess thought of that version. And another cool thing about before you answer is with Jaws, Peter Benchley, who's actually in the movie, he's the reporter on the beach in a couple of scenes. His book was improved by Hollywood. Most books are destroyed by Hollywood, but that movie was improved, or that book was improved. See, in the book, the ending is different than in the movie. In the movie, the shark goes into the cabin of the boat, and the sheriff throws the bottle of oxygen into his face, and the shark swims away, and he hits it with a rifle and blows the shark's head up, which is very cool special effect. In the book, the shark swims into the cabin of the boat, and the sheriff guy, he swims up to the surface while the ship sinks, and the shark just drowns to death. So that's how the book ended. So the ending for the movie improved the ending of the book. But I'm curious what you could tell us, what Anthony Burgess's reaction to his book done in the same light. Was he pissed off as king or what?
It depended like what era you talked to Anthony Burgess about it. His opinion on that has fluctuated back and forth. And you also got to kind of remember Burgess was about every bit as much of a megalomaniac as Kubrick was. Yeah. Despite that, they seem to have gotten along remarkably well, though. In fact, Burgess, if I remember correctly, was actually brought in to work on the screenplay for AI or Eyes Wide Shut. I think it was AI, but it could have been Eyes Wide Shut during the 1980s. So this would have been a good 10, 15 years or something after Kubrick had adapted A Clockwork Orange. But I think Burgess, he did criticize Kubrick a lot publicly, especially for not using the 21st chapter, like you're saying, as the ending, and instead sort of sticking with the original American ending. I think that was always a point of contention.
It's a cool ending, though, because it's a cliffhanger, because you see that glint in Alex's eye at the end where you think he might do some evil again, which is not the case if you read the actual 21st chapter, but I think he did a remarkable job with it. The special effects in it are, kind of lackluster, but the sets were kind of neat. Very, very, acid trip kind of mentality there, especially with all the writing on the wall in the milk bar. But the soundtrack of it is probably my favorite soundtrack of all movie soundtracks of all time.
Yeah, it was one of the first to really use like synthesizers heavily, by Wendy Carlos.
Well, at the time was Walter Carlos.
One of the first celebrity transgenders as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But fantastic keyboardist, despite his proclivities. Really, really, really excellent. He took some really hard Beethoven pieces. So in the book, the kid, Alexander Delarge, he likes Bach. But Kubrick didn't like Bach. He thought Bach was too mathematical or something. I can't remember what. So he used Beethoven. Beethoven's pretty hard too. But Walter took these pieces and put them into short, really, really cool synthesizer pieces. And he actually worked with Erno Moog, who invented the Moog, with the Moog synthesizer. So that's a very cool connection there.
No, it totally is. And I definitely think the soundtrack is one of the most striking parts of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think in some ways Burgess was even jealous of Kubrick in the sense that I think that he would never acknowledge this, but I think he kind of grudgingly realized that Kubrick had done a better version of his story than he had done with the novel. So I kind of feel like that was another reason why Burgess felt the need to lash out at the movie periodically, because it's cut into, I think, the praise that he believed that he so justly deserved, if you will. But another thing about A Clockwork Orange that's interesting, sort of getting back to like what I was talking about before, is Kubrick's financial considerations. Because this is like a movie a lot of people are going to point to as something that was, you know, a total like artistic move by Kubrick to try to adapt this really hard novel into a feature film. And that cannot really be further from the truth. In fact, it was very much done for financial reasons. And this is, of course, coming after 2001, which, even though it was successful because Kubrick had driven the budget of that up so much, the movie had really barely broken even on its initial run, and it took quite a few years for it to really turn in the money that it was later connected with, in terms of like being a major box office champion, if you will. So anyway, a couple of years after that, Kubrick was really struggling to get funding for his films. He really wanted to do his long gestating Napoleon project at this point in time, and no studio was willing to pony up the kind of money to make that. Yeah. So in the intern, Easy Rider came out, and it became one of the most successful movies ever made. In fact, to this day, it's still one of the most successful movies ever made. It, I think, had a budget of like $500,000 or something like that, and it ended up grossing close to $100 million on its original run. And this is in 1969 dollars. So just think about what that is now for the budget that it had. I mean, it's, like I said, it's still to this day one of the most successful films that's ever been made. So suddenly everybody wanted to copy the Easy Rider formula, which was basically you took a tried and true genre picture, in this case, the biker movie, which Hollywood had been making for years, like The Wild One. It's an exploitation film. You add some counterculture gloss to it, a kind of a soundtrack that will appeal to the kids, a little nudity, this and that, and suddenly you've taken what's basically a classic Hollywood film and you've made it into a counterculture movie. And basically, that's what Kubrick's doing with A Clockwork Orange. He's taking another, you know, old school genre picture, in this case, the juvenile delinquent movie, you know, think like Rebel Without a Cause, giving it a sci-fi setting, putting a lot of TNA in it. He's got his kooky Wendy Carlos soundtrack. Yeah. And it really captured the sort of emerging punk, or what would become the punk aesthetic, in a couple of years as well. So it's very much a timely piece and a film of its era. And that's why A Clockwork Orange is the most successful movie, in my opinion, that Kubrick made in terms of dollars and cents. Because, again, it only made half the money that 2001 did, but it also cost, I think, only about a fifth of what 2001 did as well. So he was
you can see where the money's spent. It's in
everything's on the screen.
Yeah, that and that one set, the Malaco Plus Milk Bar, that's where a lot of money went, because it's just an unusual space. To do that, and I don't know who painted it, but it's 100% the prelude, or the prelude to the 70s, how the 70s art would eventually become. So I thought that was neat, that whole bar scene with the plastic mannequins that you cut milk from their boobs. I mean, who comes up with that kind of stuff? I mean,
yeah, no, it was great. Yeah. I mean, I think that was like the only set that they really built for the movie too.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I guarantee that's where a good bit of that money was spent. It was on that set alone.
Most of it actually went to getting the rights for Anthony Burgess's novel, and then I think most of the rest of the budget went towards getting Malcolm McDowell to star in it. So,
they also bought the rights to Singing in the Rain.
Yeah, no, I remember that was another issue that they had later on, because that was actually all improvised, the whole scene with him doing Singing in the Rain for that.
Right. Yep.
My question is this: why the hell are they making us read that in high school? They want us to like be spree killers. I'm like,
I was gonna say.
I remember it.
You guys were actually lucky if you got to read that in high school, man. We got like Their Eyes Are Watching God.
We did.
A few novels I've actually, afterwards, was finally able to read through without getting lost. Weird. But I was gonna bring that up at some point. You know, what they don't tell you in the movie is how old our perpetrators are. So in the book, Alex and his three droogs, those four little kids, they're 15, 14, 14, and 13 years old.
Yeah, I think that was the other change, is Kubrick raised the age, because I think they were supposed to be like around 18 in the movie, like 17, 18 thereabouts.
Just at the end of high school or just graduated high school, whatever the timeline is. But yes, older than 15. But the two middle droogs, Dim and Georgie, no, I forget the two in the middle were 14, and then the youngest one, Georgie, was 13 years old. 13 years old. These kids are running around raping pillaging, stealing, killing people. It was just an unbelievable novel for the time. I mean, I think the novel came out.
He wrote in the early 60s, I think like 62 or something.
60, I want to say 60, 61, yeah. Very edgy subject matter, even for that time.
No, it absolutely was. And I mean, well, there's a lot of weird stuff with Burgess as well with all of that, because he was, I believe, detailed to MI5 around that time frame. And there was, in recent years, there's been speculation that there were some coded references that he had put in the novel to some of the behavior modification programs that the cousins were engaged in, because it was also sort of written again in this time frame coming like after the Suez Crisis, and that it really humiliated the British Empire, because basically the United States had cut off the funding supply and they were exposed as not being able to project force without American backing. So there's a lot of hard feelings about that. And there's kind of some thinking that one of the reasons why Burgess was instructed to write A Clockwork Orange is it was meant to be a bit of a limited hangout as to some of the behavior modification stuff that the cousins were toying with at the time. Because again, you got to kind of remember, this is years before the public started to hear about like MK Ultra and anything like that. So it's kind of interesting to look at some of the possibilities with that as well, in terms of the parapolitics behind the writing of it.
I mean, I like the book and I'm glad we read it and everything, but it's like Georgia. It just seems like you wouldn't expect it in a lot of ways. This was in Georgia.
It's a really strange book, and I don't remember the exact incident, but it's at some point it was rumored to be inspired by a home invasion and the rape of the author's wife, Anthony Burgess. And then I looked into it, and I don't remember what I found out, but there's something to the home invasion story that inspired Anthony Burgess to write this book. So if this book is inspired by his wife having been raped by a home invasion,
I haven't heard that. That's
Recluse can probably clear us up on that. But there's some issue there with that. Was the huge rumor, I guess, in the 70s and 80s.
Well, yes, that was actually what the official narrative was put out about. But again, this was like the really controversial biography that I read about Burgess, where they got into that. But let's just say, like, he didn't have the best relationship with his wife during this time frame. And there's an argument that he essentially played up that angle to elicit sympathy when he had published the book, because as my understanding, there's been arguments made that they were kind of on the outs at that point in time. Like they were not, I think, even necessarily living together or something to that effect. But it was sort of something along the lines that he had behaved remarkably insensitive towards his wife throughout the whole ordeal when she was in the aftermath of it, when she was coping with the trauma from it. And then later on, it was just sort of like, oh, yeah, it was really hard for me, too. I mean, I know nobody noticed it at the time and I was ignoring her and everything. But no, I was really struggling with it. I swear I was. Yeah, Burgess is, in a lot of ways, he's as colorful a figure as Kubrick is, to put it mildly.
Yeah. And he was sort of a one-hit wonder, whereas Kubrick...
that was, I think, another sort of source of aggravation for Burgess, too, is he was never able to sort of capture the acclaim that he did. And really, I mean, it was only after Kubrick made the movie version as well that it kind of considered a literary classic. I mean, it was very... it had received a lot of positive reviews and stuff, but I would say the book was more of a cult classic at the time when the film was made of it, and that kind of turned it into like a major literary masterpiece, the kind of thing the kids get to read at school.
What was Barry Lyndon? Is it Lyndon? I know
Lyndon.
That was one of his first movies. Was that his first? No, what was it? His first movie was some kind of mafia.
Killer's Kiss.
Gangster. Yeah, I've never seen that one.
Fear and Desire. Fear and Desire was his first one.
No, that's not. There's one about like gambling and races or something.
Oh, that's The Killing.
Okay, I haven't seen that and the other one that we just mentioned then. So there's some old ass ones I haven't seen.
Yeah, Fear and Desire was like his first war movie, and then The Killing was the first sort of successful movie that he did. It essentially was almost like a remake of John Huston's Asphalt Jungle. It's a very similar storyline, and it even has the same star in it, Sterling Hayden, though Kubrick didn't end up getting a young Marilyn Monroe for his picture. But yeah, it's a really interesting movie because of the fact that it has this sort of non-linear narrative to it. It was something that Tarantino later copied for Reservoir Dogs, essentially, and also the whole fact that you never see the actual robbery happening in either film. So that's kind of another thing with The Killing, where it's essentially the audience reconstructing some of these events after the fact. And then the whole elaborate setup that they had for the crime, where it's like they're going to try to assassinate a horse with a sniper, and just, kind of crazy stuff like that. But I'm a big film noir fan, so I definitely dig it. I mean, it's got a fantastic cast besides Sterling Hayden. There's oh gosh, I know there's one of the guys who's in a lot of the Bogart movies, like Maltese Falcon. I cannot remember Elijah Cook, maybe, or something like that. God, he's like a major character actor in so many of these films. But it's a great example of early film noir. It was actually a script that was co-written by Jim Thompson, who was one of my favorite novelists. One of his books was later adapted as The Grifters. I don't know if you guys remember that. That was from like 1990. I think it was like Gina Davis. Yeah, John Cusack. Yeah. So he did a lot of like really hard-boiled novels, but it's an interesting film, and I think that the overall influence that film noir had on Kubrick's career is generally overlooked, especially given the extent to which he worked with black and white early in his career. I mean, he really, aside from Spartacus, he really didn't go over to color movies until 2001.
Oh God, sorry. Oh my God, some saliva.
Yeah, we've actually made arguments before on shows where we talked about movies. Like, what if a director nowadays intentionally made a movie in black and white and then aired it on TV for the first time? Most of the now generation would be like, "What happened to the TV? Where's all the color?" Figure out what the hell's wrong with the picture. Black and white, you can't develop color. It has to go through like a machine with computers and chemicals and all that. Black and white film you can develop in your backyard in a garage with no light. I took photography in college as electives. Black and white it makes such great contrasts. I don't know why people don't use it anymore, but
there's a few that do. There's a few. The Lighthouse. There's not many.
There's not many. Yeah.
No,
but is it actual motion film they're doing, or are they taking a digital camera and then when they get to the editing bay, they put it in the computer and tweak it and turn it to black and white? It's not quite the same thing, but
I think that's what they did with like Sin City, where I believe they shot it like on digital and then they turned it black and white. Even though I did think that was a great use of like black and white, but yeah, I think you're right.
Well, in the exact reverse, in the movie Tron, all the scenes where they're inside the computer, that's all filmed in black and white emulsion, all of it. And then they took those pieces they wanted colored, and they took them to Korea, and all of those frames were hand colored, like the suits that had those little blue or red or orange lines in them. All of that, and all the animation of that energy going through those lines is all hand painted frame by frame. We're talking millions of individual frames that had to be individually painted one at a time. So it was exactly the exact reverse, where they had to use a black and white film to make a digital realm. And then nowadays we're using digital realm and then going into the editing bay and using digital media and taking that color, and there's your sepia tone 1950s movie.
There's one by the Coen brothers, The Man Who Wasn't
There.
Yeah,
The Man Who Wasn't There. Yeah, that's a really underrated movie. That actually is probably the most underrated Coen
Billy
brothers
Bob
movie.
Thornton, and then
he's fantastic in that.
A weird UFO thing even happens. Some kind of UFO situation.
No, that's great at the end of that movie too, when he's, I think, in prison or something, and like his cell just sort of like randomly opens up and he walks out and sees the UFO, and it's just kind of like, and then he just walks back in the cell. Oh, that was like the scene that made that movie, if you've seen it.
One thing I just saw that I sent y'all, and we're not going to talk about this long, we'll get back on the subject, but I hope this is real. There's a picture of, I sent it to you on Facebook, both of you, a picture of, I guess, people in England lined up down the street, and it seems to be real. It says a bookshop owner in Southampton, England, has asked for help as he moves his library due to high rent and wants to move the books to the new location. The person is surprised by the presence of more than 250 young people, elderly, and special needs people who were also involved. They form a human chain where they take thousands of books and transfer them hand in hand from the old place to the new place at a distance of 500 feet. The job was done in just an hour. I sent it to you. It was just something I came across real fast, but shows a picture of them all just passing books up to 500 feet to the new shop from the old shop. And just one of those stories. Hopefully it's not AI. I noticed one thing. You say Saturn returns. Saturn's supposed to be my Capricornian planet. Of course, a lot of people like to say it's Satan and all this stuff, and Capricorn sit the devil and all this stuff, which a lot of tarot people do that. But what is the symbolism here with Saturn returns? And I know you say the mass ball and mass ball symbolism with eyes wide shut. Is that what that all revolves around, the Saturn situation?
Yeah, I definitely think that, I think 2001 and Eyes Wide Shut are both really tied in heavily with the Saturn symbolism. It's not as obvious in 2001 because Kubrick wasn't able to get the effects ready in time to present Saturn and specifically the ring. So they ended up having the final destination to Jupiter for the space flight. But originally he had wanted it to be Saturn. And that was, I think, what ended up in the book by Arthur C. Clarke that was released. But yeah, I think that at the core of both 2001 and Eyes Wide Shut, both of these pictures revolve around the ancient art of theurgy, which essentially involved two separate processes. So this would be kind of like the underlining magical system that's indicated by, say, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And this goes into the ancient belief that the human soul originated in outer space and specifically in the Milky Way. I don't really know why it's the Milky Way, but a lot of traditions place the human soul's origins as the Milky Way. So as the theory goes, when we are born and we incarnate, we travel through the celestial spheres and go through these different planets and so forth. This is kind of like the whole thing with our astrological chart and what have you, how we get these beneficial effects and what have you from these different planets through the process of incarnation. And then we end up here. And then when we die, we return back to the Milky Way, going through this similar process through the celestial spheres and so forth. So the ancients believed through the art of theurgy that the magician could go through this process before he had shed his mortal coil. And this plays into, again, depending on what school you're looking at, whether it's Gnostic, where it's Neoplatonianism. But in some schools, the thinking is that in order to continue passing up the celestial spheres to return to the Milky Way, you needed certain codes, passwords, things like that to give these planetary intelligences. And this is why you wanted to practice this while you were still alive, so that when you did die, you knew what to do to return home, so to speak. And to me, this is at the core of what is being depicted in 2001: A Space Odyssey, especially when you start getting to the weird part after the HAL 2000 has been, was it HAL 9000? Can't remember now, but
HAL 9000 is the computer, yes.
HAL 9000. So this is like what they're basically getting at after HAL has been disassembled and he goes through the whole Stargate process. You see how they have the conjunctions of the planets there. The ancients believed that essentially there were 2 times the year when the gates opened and you could do these sort of stellar travels. And one would have been during the winter solstice and the other would have been during the summer solstice. And specifically, if you happen to overlap with a conjunction between, say, the planets, especially Jupiter and Saturn, which is a really big deal for all of this. So the conjunction, that is a sign of the gates opening, and Bowman is able to project his consciousness into the great beyond and return to this other sphere of being, so to speak.
We're supposed to have something like that coming up in June or July, where the conjunction of like 5 or 6 planets, and I think Saturn and Jupiter are 2 of them.
Makes sense, given all the stuff that's happening.
July, it's going. I have to look on the computer again and search for it. But they're going to be a line in an angled line up in the sky at some point. That's a huge conjunction right there. I wonder what's going to happen to planet Earth when we go through that.
June 3rd, I think. I thought I saw.
Maybe, yeah. Let me see if I can find it again.
Well,
So,
we
yeah.
also have Eric Grimsrud who says the devil comet is the Mabus comet and Trump is Mabus and Trump's about to croak. And I saw somebody say something weird about the head wound thing from Revelation, that they might try to pull that with Trumpelgooch, like coming back from the dead, like Revelations and all that crap. But we also have that devil comet or whatever that's been doing craziness. And what else? I know I saw that alignment, some kind of graphic of it on Facebook about the.
Okay, yeah. So the next 6-planet alignment will happen on August 28th, when Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune align. That will be cool. So August 28th.
Interesting.
This year.
So just off the cuff, I know you've probably seen lots of stuff about this, but what do you know about Saturn? What's the big hoo-ha? Because I know, didn't Hitler like have sons of Saturn? And I see all these references calling Saturn Satan and a lot of this kind of conspiracy kind of stuff. Why do they think
it's the most moons of any planet in our solar system?
Why is it Satan, or is that just superstition?
Oh, well, let's see. How to get into that. To some extent, you could see some of the associations with what would later become the Christian Satan with Saturn. I would imagine that this probably goes back to the perspective of the Greeks with Cronus, and then later this was sort of filtered through the cult of Saturn in Rome, though obviously the Romans had a very different perspective of Saturn. Well, I shouldn't say hugely different, but typically the Romans saw the age of Saturn as the so-called golden age, if you will, and the one that we had moved away from in a more debased form that we were now living in. But in terms of the association with Satan, I think specifically that relates to the time in the Roman Republic when they were engaged in the Punic Wars, and specifically it would have been the Second Punic War. This is the war that involved Hannibal of Carthage, and it was the one that really threatened the existence of the Roman Republic. So the Romans had a ritual that was known as evoctico or something to that effect.
Saturnalia or something.
I was going to ask, wasn't there something like Saturnalia, which is also associated with Bacchus?
That's what I'm getting to. I'm going to explain why Saturnalia is important.
Yeah.
So basically, this was a ritual in which you would take a god of another people and from their pantheon, and you would bring it into the Roman pantheon, essentially transforming it into
and any associated holidays. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the Romans were really wigged out about what is happening here. Their armies are getting their asses kicked by Hannibal. They're not able to leave the cities. Things are starting to get really, really dire. So the Romans, besides conventional warfare, also engaged in spiritual warfare. So they decided one way that they could get the heads up over the Carthaginians, so to speak, would be to transform the Carthaginian god Baal-Ammon into their own pantheon. And again, if you are familiar with this deity, it has long been associated with child sacrifice. For many years, there has been a debate as to how accurate some of the accounts were of child sacrifice was. Probably the Romans did exaggerate the amount of kids that were killed, but based on some of the excavations that have been done around ancient Carthage, it does seem that the Carthaginians did engage in human sacrifice, and specifically the aristocracy would, I believe, sacrifice their oldest sons at certain times of the year for their festivals. Wow. So the Romans had a time of the year when they did these rituals, and that was the Saturnalia. And they decided that they were going to bring Baal-Hammon into their pantheon as Saturn. And in order to do that, the Romans engaged in the one really major time in their history where it can be accounted for that they engaged in human sacrifice. They basically killed multiple people on the Capitol Hill as part of this ritual, and that served as the basis almost for the reversal of roles that was so prevalent in the later Saturnalia festivals and whatnot, because the Romans were basically embracing these practices of a foreign people's gods that were appalling to them. And it was sort of this reversal of orders that would later be brought into the Saturnalia holiday. For those of you unfamiliar, essentially slaves would become masters, masters would become slaves. They would go around their palaces serving the slaves and stuff like that. And that was all sort of a part of this ritual process where you consume the gods of other cultures into your own pantheon. And yeah, I think that really also played a factor in Eyes Wide Shut and Kubrick's decision to set it during Christmas, because it's never really explained. There's really no reason for the movie to be set during Christmas, and they really hardly ever even mention it in the film in terms of the dialogue, but it's omnipresent everywhere. They definitely make it very clear to you that it's being celebrated.
Visual cues, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it also sort of gets back to the 2 times the year I was talking about, where the gates to heaven would be open. So this is also happening during the winter solstice, and that was the reason why they did that. Because, see, as I was kind of talking about before, the magician can send his consciousness up to the heavens. But the other way this works is you can draw something down from the heavens into you. This would be the process of drawing down the moon. So for this festival, the Romans are drawing down this entity, Balaman, with human sacrifices to try to bring it into their pantheon and thus make the god a part of their civilization. And it worked. I mean, they were able to withstand Hannibal. They eventually went to Africa. Scipio Africanus defeated him. They defeated Carthage, and then they came back for the Third Carthaginian War. They defeated the Carthaginians. They slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the city. They burned it to the ground, and supposedly they even put salt over the city so that nothing would grow there. They totally erased all traces of Carthage and almost destroyed everything in terms of the written language and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And that really served as the basis for what made the Roman Empire feared throughout the world. Because when the Romans defeated you, that was, if you were lucky, they would just conquer you and enslave you and so forth. If you really pissed them off, they would utterly annihilate you, your civilization, your culture, everything.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, not funny, but they did the same thing to a couple other cultures in the Mediterranean, where like there were at least 2. Carthage was one of them, and another, I can't remember the
was it like the
specific one?
Oh, they basically
but they all had. Well, but the 2 that I'm thinking of had a language that was like hieroglyphics. They didn't have quite the alphabet like the Romans did. The Roman.
Yeah, I know what you're. I'm not thinking of one specifically, but I mean, I know, like in the case of like the Celtic religion, I mean, they basically exterminated the Druids as well. And I mean, all of that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we know so little about what Celtic paganism was like, because it was just annihilated by the Romans, basically.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I feel like it might have been Pontus or something like that, but you're absolutely right. There was another civilization along those lines where they utterly annihilated. Maybe it was the Etruscans.
Maybe so. Yeah, it might be. They destroyed the civilization, as much of their whatever parts of the cities they made. They try to destroy all that, and their languages, anything on the walls, art, anything that would leave any kind of trace of their culture or intelligence or existence, even. And it's just, we still found it, but wow.
Yeah, it took a lot of effort, though.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, so this is, again, like I said, why the Romans were so feared. In fact, they had that, they pretty much the unofficial motto of the Roman Empire. What was it? Let them hate us so long as they fear us, which isn't really an issue. A lot of people came to fear the Romans.
Yeah.
So what was the deal with Eyes Wide Shut? Was that the Illuminati? Did you ever reveal exactly what was going on there?
Well, I think that this was essentially his attempt to reconstruct what a cult of Saturn would have actually looked like. And this is something that, I mean, a lot of conventional Kubrick scholars have really dismissed for a lot of years. But when I was researching the Kubrick book, I was able to get at least a partial list of some of the sources that Kubrick had used. And one of these was a really interesting book called Cults and the Occult. It's a collection of articles. It was edited by a bloke called Peter Brooks-Smith, I think. It's a fairly rare book now, but it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it. Some of it just deals with more conventional occultism like tarot and astrology and this kind of stuff. But there's quite a bit in the book that deals with sex magic. And one of the really interesting sections in it deals specifically with the Brotherhood of Saturn. So I would have to think that Kubrick would have certainly have read this, given how meticulous he did a lot of this. And it's interesting because this was research that was done by Francis King, and King was really the first person to publish anything in the English language about the Brotherhood of Saturn. It was quite unknown in the 1980s. Really, to this day, it's still pretty unknown. But in the 1980s,
what's the book called again?
It was called Cult and the Occult. It was edited by Peter Brooks Smith, if I remember correctly. It's a bit like the Man, Myth, and Legends, I think, or whatever they were called. It was the books that James Shelby Downard had really used. It's kind of a similar thing. It's almost like an encyclopedia of different occult traditions that some of these various authors had put together. But the whole thing is actually really scholarly, which I suppose shouldn't be surprising since it was work that Kubrick was drawing from. But after I read that and became aware that he did have a knowledge of the Brotherhood of Saturn, it seemed to me very evident that this what he was going for, because you already had all of these other references to the Saturnalia, and it's been known for a considerable amount of time that Kubrick was a huge fan of George Fraser, big fan of the Golden Bough. In fact, I think he bought an entire 18 volume original publishing of it for one of the executives of Warner Brothers and sent it to him as like a Christmas present. The executive was like, "This is great, Stanley, but what am I really supposed to do with these books?" And Kubrick was basically like, "Don't you understand? This is your life." Like, he was really into the Golden Bough. So, and again, if you've read the book, the Saturnalia is a big thing in that. Fraser goes into a lot of details about it. I have to believe very strongly that this was another major source of influence on Kubrick when he was developing this sort of cosmology with Eyes Wide Shut. So you have all of that kind of playing into it. And then obviously, as I had this discussion with Peter Mark Adams, you almost have to wonder, by the way, Peter Mark Adams is the author of the brilliant Game of Saturn book. I cannot recommend that enough. But you almost have to believe that Kubrick even had some kind of possible insider knowledge to this. Because again, he just gets so much stuff with the rest of the film so right. I know in terms of Somerton, the mansion where they have the mass ball at, one of the sources for this was Hearst Castle, which is a really remarkable place. If you've ever gone there, Kubrick was familiar with it. It was actually used as one of the locations in Spartacus. I think it was actually for Crassus's village. But I would bet money that Hearst Castle is actually where Kubrick got the idea to use the 8-pointed stars all over Ziegler's mansion and Eyes Wide Shut, because the 8-pointed stars are everywhere in Hearst Castle. So it's very difficult to miss if you've been there. But there's just certain features to these elite mansions that they all have. One of them are these weird, like, Venetian pews that you see a little bit of in Eyes Wide Shut. Another are these Greco-Roman tapestries, which, again, you definitely see in the Somerton mansion. And then another are these really freaking weird, I don't know, like fish-looking monster things. I don't know exactly what to describe them as, but I've seen reliefs of this stuff at like Noirs, at the Biltmore, at Hearst Castle, and you even see this at Ziegler's mansion at the beginning of Eyes. It's actually in the scene where the prostitute is overdosed. Tom Cruise is like brought in to revive her, and there's just this picture in the background you see of his fireplace, and it's got this weird, fish monster thing like right there beside of it. And it was like when I was going back and rewatching Eyes Wide Shut for the book, I was like, holy crap, I've seen these things at like all of these freaking elite mansions that I've gone to. But there's just like certain odd staples of that like having gone to.
It's like Dagon.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically like the Dagon like representation or something like that. It's very bizarre. Yeah. But this is just like some characteristics like that. All of these mansions really seem to have them. And Kubrick, this is something to my mind that he got absolutely so right with Eyes Wide Shut. And beyond that, I just feel with the implications of Somerton, it doesn't seem like that this is a place that anybody lives in. And that's something that you get impression that you get when you actually go to these places in real life. Like the Biltmore, for instance. I mean, this is something even in the official narrative, like they'll tell you the Vanderbilts only lived at this place maybe a month out of the entire year. So when you think about the amount of money that they sunk into this, I mean, they basically had to build a freaking town like outside of the Biltmore just to produce like the materials for it and what have you, because I mean, there was like nothing there when they set it up. So it's like you go to North Carolina in this isolated place, you build this huge ass freaking mansion where the local economy can't even sustain it. You've got to build up stuff just to have like staffs and stuff for it. And then you're only going to spend maybe a month out of the entire freaking year living there. I mean, yes, they're rich. They can do a lot of extravagant things with their money, but it's just like, why would you embark on this kind of a project for something that you're barely going to use? And
I mean, the cost alone of keeping that building,
maintaining the thing, it's astronomical.
In structural health for every year outweighs living there for a month.
Yeah, it's like it makes no sense with a lot of these places. I mean, it's like the same thing with the Anderson House in DC, which, again, this is a major elite family. The wife was a member of the Weld family, who built Harvard up. This is old Yankee money. They have this really elaborate townhouse in DC. It's loaded with all of this, I think, huge high-end artwork and stuff. It was donated to the Society of Cincinnati. But this is like another one. They only spent 1 month out of the year living in this place. And just having a townhouse that size in DC, even like in the 30s, would have been astronomically expensive. And then when you look at like all of the rare art and stuff, the tapestries and all the crap like that they put in it, you're barely going to use this.
While we're talking about elaborate mansions, did you hear that Graceland, Elvis's mansion, is up for auction? There's a stop sale on it right now while his granddaughter Riley Keough tries to fight it.
I heard it was a scam, like by some Nigerian or something.
Yeah, they're trying. There's a lot of dispute as to whether or not, like, it was, if they even had the rights to it or something like that. But it did seem like it was pretty frivolous.
But in any event, it's in the news. But imagine, even if it winds up being false and she gets it back, whatever. Imagine being able to pick up that piece of property for really cheap. I mean, just think of all the stuff inside of it that you could sell and like triple or quadruple your money.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, you've got, I think, Elvis's body in there alone. I mean, that alone, you could sell like relics of the king or something like that.
Yeah, that granddaughter lady that you just mentioned her name, that
Riley Keough.
She's in that Sasquatch Sunset movie as one of the Sasquatchers. Yes, with Jesse Eisenberg.
See, I actually have kind of wondered if like Elvis ascended into becoming Bigfoot or something like that after he died. Well, actually, it depends whether or not he even died in the first place.
They might have took him to Avalon.
Do you guys like realize when it comes to like sightings in this country, like Elvis, I think, is like number 3 behind Bigfoot and Jesus or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, he did have a unique look, but I just think he was. I mean, I wasn't around when he was alive for very long. I remember when he died. I was probably, I don't know, 10 or 12. I don't remember exactly, but he put such an impression on the world that
he was a Capricorn.
Must be it. I don't know, but he put such an impression on the world that, I mean, he is essentially immortal. So did he die? I don't think so, because here it is, how many years? 30, 40 years after he's died, and people still talk about him. There are in every state hundreds of licensed entertainers who entertain as Elvis impersonators.
Have you seen Bubba Hotep?
I love Bubba Hotep.
What happened? I've had Joe on about that, about a lot of crap, Joe R. Lansdale, but Bubba Hotep is a must see. Have you seen that, Jay? Bubba Hotep?
I don't think so. I've heard of it, but I don't think I've seen it.
It's Bruce Campbell playing Elvis. I mean, that alone is. As soon as I heard Bruce Campbell was playing Elvis, I was just like, I don't even care what the movie is about.
Must see that. I'll check it out.
It's basically about a mummy that gets dumped off, an ancient mummy, and it still souls out of people's buttholes in an elderly home, and then Elvis is there.
Oh, and then Ossie Davis is his neighbor there at the old people's home.
Davis.
It's a must see. It's a must see. I'm sad the sequel.
I was just about to say that. I was always depressed they never made the sequel to it. It would have been great.
Books. There's a Bubba Hotep book by Joe R. Lansdale. There's also like a weird other book he did called Cosmic Bloodsuckers that has Bubba Hotep in it. There may be something else, but there's a few like books about it, about the story. That's where it all came from, Joe R. Lansdale. But so how does this Minotaur fit into all this?
To me, It was well, Kubrick had quite an obsession with labyrinths, that kind of thing, and then also he had named one of his later production companies Minotaur as well. So I mean, it was certainly something that he had quite an interest in. But for me, at least, as I researched his career more and more in his life personally, I kind of came to the understanding that Kubrick definitely had a lot of darkness in his personality. And I feel that in making the movies, that was almost a way of finding release for this darkness so that it didn't enter into his private life. And I feel like for Kubrick, the whole process of filmmaking was almost like going through a maze because it was such an elaborate process for him. It usually entailed, especially after 2001, years of really intense research. I mean, he really became a bona fide expert in a lot of the subjects that he would eventually make into films. The ongoing process of writing scripts. I mean, in the case of Eyes Wide Shut, that was a movie that Kubrick had worked on for nearly 30 years before it came on screen. Wow. AI was something that he had worked on for close to 30 years, I believe, as well.
Was that his last movie? Was that the last movie he did?
Well, he didn't direct that. Spielberg did direct it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, he definitely contributed elements to the screenplay. In fact, Kubrick probably had written more of it than he was given credit for. But yeah, I feel like the filmmaking process for Kubrick was almost this labyrinth that he created for himself, and as a means to, I think, trap this darkness in. Because to me, the Minotaur is this sort of monstrous presence that I think Kubrick was aware existed in his soul. And the filmmaking process was a way of trying to entrap this presence in this labyrinth so that it could not escape, so that he could have this kind of quaint family life that he was so enamored with, separate from a lot of the darker material that entered into his movies.
Yeah, he wasn't a very particularly public person. I mean, you don't see a lot of paparazzi shots of Kubrick or his family. You know, he's a very private person outside of Hollywood, which is highly unusual, especially for someone like him who is, like you say, monetarily motivated to do these films.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, I will say, though, Kubrick did figure out a way to almost use his lack of a public presence as a marketing gimmick, because in a lot of ways he sort of used that to play into the mystery around Stanley Kubrick. I mean, he was this almost like alchemist type figure who was squared away in his, laboratory, coming up with his next masterpiece, too engaged in this to really be bothered with the trappings of the mundane entertainment industry, if you will, going out to premieres and stuff. Because you're right, he never did any of that stuff. And in fact, by the early 90s, there was a man who was impersonating Kubrick in the UK. In fact, they later made a movie about this called Color Me Kubrick. John Malkovich played this character. But it was such a great story because, the guy looked absolutely nothing like Stanley Kubrick, but it didn't matter because nobody knew what Stanley Kubrick looked like anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, you could take Stanley Kubrick and put him in a lineup with other famous directors, and most people would point to Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, thinking that he was Kubrick, that would be Kubrick. But the few pictures of him, he is not, like, and I don't think, Spielberg and Lucas are, strapping, good-looking men, but they're not frumpy looking. And Kubrick just, when you look at him, he just looks like, a math teacher. He doesn't look like the type of Hollywood director you would expect to be yelling orders at you from the other side of the camera.
Yeah, no, I mean, he definitely, oh gosh, I think on top of that too, towards the end of his career, I mean, he took to wearing like military fatigues and stuff like that when he was filming a lot of his movies.
Almost in some, there's one shot of him, I think, wearing a hat that almost made him look like, what's the leader of Cuba that just died?
Castro. Yeah.
Yeah, he almost looks like, in some pictures, he looks like Castro.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. I guess it was apparently he really became fixated on military stuff after he had directed Spartacus, because I guess he had concluded after he had worked with so many extras and stuff, he would have made a great general. So he did definitely embrace some of the trappings of military life for his production. In fact, he used that whole system that Napoleon did with his officers, where he would essentially rotate people around, sometimes demoting them. In fact, he actually deliberately would demote his employees at times when they were doing good work for them, because he didn't want their egos to go out of control. So it was just kind of like, it's time to kick so and so down a peg or two. So
yeah. You're in
but
the
anyway,
mailroom, buddy.
yeah. But that was, again, that was something that he apparently learned from Napoleon. He was really quite obsessed with Napoleon and tried to model some of his directorial methods after the way Napoleon essentially ran his army. So,
Color Me Kubrick. I never saw that. It seems kind of hard to find. I was just looking around. I don't even see it on the DVD. You have to like subscribe to Magnolia, something to even see it. But looks interesting. But
oh yeah, no, it was actually written by Anthony Freeman, who was Kubrick's longtime employee. He was his essentially, he was the guy who headed his research staff towards the last 20 or so years of Kubrick's career. But Freeman was a guy I wrote quite a bit about in the book, and he's a really interesting guy because he had a lot of interaction with conspiracy circles over the years, and especially with the JFK assassination community. He was really, really active in the JFK assassination community going into the 1980s, and he had even contributed several articles to Lobster magazine. And for those of you unfamiliar, Lobster magazine was really the premier parapolitical publication in the UK for a lot of years. It's still active. In fact, it was really arguably the premier parapolitical publication in the entire world. It was, for years, it was run by Robin Ramsey and, oh gosh, I can't remember the guy's name. No, Stephen Dorff. But they also had written quite a few excellent works on some of the intrigues in the UK. And you just had a lot of other interesting people turning up in it, like Martin Cannon, for instance. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he wrote The Controllers back in the late 80s, early 90s, and was one of the first guys to really push the notion that UFO abductions were possibly part of CIA behavior modification programs, let's just say. But it was really interesting for me to see that Freeman was a part of this milieu, because he did have articles appearing in Lobster with guys like Martin Cannon, Robin Ramsey, really throughout the 1980s. Freeman also definitely has an interest in a lot of the Pentagon and the CIA's behavior modification work. One of the last articles I found that he contributed to Lobster magazine was a review of Hank Albarilla's A Terrible Mistake, his great book on Frank Olson. Freeman had some really interesting comments to make about that book in the review as well. So I was really struck by this, because Stanley Kubrick really tried to micromanage his employees. There's some really notorious instances of this with the writers that he was working with, because typically, because it took him years to develop a screenplay, he would put his screenwriters under contract. And as part of the agreement, they could not work on anything or do any other kind of financial endeavor when they were employed with Kubrick. So one writer, after he had not worked with Kubrick for several months, had agreed to do a speaking engagement, like a con or something like that, make a little money on the side. So he went down there, does the speaking engagement. He got Stanley Kubrick a postcard and sent it to him, and like, "Hey, Stan, hope you're having a great time. Can't wait to start writing again with you." And Kubrick responded by filing a lawsuit against him for breach of contract. So Kubrick was...
And probably won too, didn't he?
He did. Kubrick was really, really hardcore about what his employees got up to outside of working for him. So this is where the whole thing with Freeman being engaged in this is so interesting, because this is another thing I get into in the book. I strongly believe that Kubrick had inside knowledge, at least some inside knowledge, as it pertains to the Kennedy assassination, because there's just so much stuff in Dr. Strangelove that really, I think you would have had to have some kind of insider access to put into that film. So it's interesting that, I mean, about 15 years after he does that movie, Free One shows up and starts publishing all this stuff with Lobster Magazine on the Kennedy assassination. His boss is fanatical about monitoring what his employees are doing outside of work. So Kubrick, again, is extremely image conscious. If it had come out to the broader public, that Free was engaged in the JFK assassination community, it would have certainly put Stanley in a certain light. And I got to think that he was okay with that at a minimum, because he never seems to have tried to have stopped Free One from engaging in this kind of research. And that's really interesting, especially since, as I said before, Free One was also essentially the director of Stanley Kubrick's research. That was his day job. So I've definitely wondered if Kubrick was not only aware of this and had tactically approved of it, but might even have been maybe pushing Free One to engage in this and put out some of this research. Because I really think that Kubrick had more subtle interaction with the sort of parapolitical and conspiracy research communities over the years than a lot of people have even begun to contemplate.
Yeah, I wonder if he had directed JFK instead of
Oliver Stone.
Thank you. I just did a whole bunch of research a few weeks ago on JFK for another show on the network, but I wonder how different JFK would be, if Kubrick had done it instead.
Yeah,
I mean, Stone did a fantastic job. Don't get me wrong; it's one of my favorite movies, but what would be the differences if Kubrick had did it?
Well, it's interesting too, because one of the books that Free One had written was actually an entire work that just deals with all of the works of fiction that had depicted the JFK assassination. So it was kind of interesting. Free One was actually monitoring a lot of the stuff that was going on with the making of JFK as well, and kind of the lead up to the film. And he's also written some fictional novels too, and one of them, I can't remember the name of the book now off the top of my head, but it deals specifically with the Kennedy assassination, with there possibly being this British angle to it. And it's really interesting because a lot of the novel is set in the same area in the UK where Kubrick's mansion was. I would say the lead character is a rather thinly veiled version of Free One as well. So there's a lot of stuff with that I'm very disappointed more people haven't looked into, because I really think there's a lot of meat on that Kubrick Kennedy bone that people have not gotten to yet, and it's some pretty juicy meat on top of that.
It's definitely as far as Kubrick, there's just so many controversial things to talk about. I mean, we're at the halfway point. We had about 35 minutes left or something, or close to 40. And one thing I keep seeing in my head is that monolith. What is it, like monkeys or apes or whatever they are, or cavemen in the Space Odyssey? Yeah. What exactly was the significance of that on a symbolic level?
The object gave them evolution. They when you first see them, they're peaceful creatures, and then after the object appears, they learn how to kill.
Yes, essentially, it's more or less Kubrick's interpretation of the Garden of Eden, because essentially they live in this sort of like paradise before war is basically introduced by the obelisk. And it's also, I think that's also kind of one of the early points as well, when you see Kubrick hinting at this process of theurgy that I was sort of talking about before, being in 2001. And it's even sort of explicit with the main proto-human's name, which is Moonwatcher. But I mean, he's basically there staring into the celestial spheres right before the monolith appears. And then you essentially are led to believe that he gets this knowledge for how to develop weapons by basically sitting there and staring at it. But I think what he's actually doing, the monolith, I think, is meant to be perceived as sort of a John Dee-esque obsidian mirror, if you will. And it's something that he's basically using as a form of scrying to take one of these celestial journeys to gain knowledge. And very much Kubrick really drives this home with the famous jump cut. It might be the most famous jump cut in cinematic history, where the bone gets tossed into the air and it turns into a satellite. But really, at that point, very much emphasizing technological evolution being tied to warfare. And it's kind of clever, too, when he gets into the space station. They kind of later mirror the opening part of the movie where, you have the two different tribes of proto-humans kind of gathering around the watering hole and stuff, and they get into the conflict. And you basically see that in the space station later on with the US and the Russian scientists and what have you. They're basically sitting around that table, which mirrors the lake from the introduction, and the same sort of poses and positions and what have you. So I think that was kind of him also driving home that there often was this tragedy that was associated with evolutionary advances.
And one big thing that I've seen a lot of, and I could have sworn I've even seen things saying he said it himself, which I don't remember if I watched it or if it's true, but where did the moon landing controversy come from? And is there any truth to that? He was involved in something with that at all?
Well, it all goes back to the first book that was written on the moon landing potentially being a hoax, which was a book by Bill Kaysing, which I think was just basically called "Did We Ever Go to the Moon?" or something like that. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But Kaysing published this book in 1976, I think, and he never actually claimed that Kubrick faked the moon landing. What he did claim was that the film 2001 had been made so that it could develop the cinematic techniques that would be necessary for NASA to fake the moon landing. Basically, it was a cover to develop the special effects that would be necessary for such an operation. But Kaysing never indicated that it was Kubrick himself who had actually directed the hoax moon landing stuff. So, go ahead.
The counterpoint that I have to that is, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what I was told. Kubrick did consult with NASA on their missions to the moon, what kind of cameras they should use. And I believe his favorite kind was the Aeroflex type of camera, and they're fairly large. They probably do make a 16 millimeter, but because of weight constraints, they couldn't use even a 16 millimeter camera. So they had to go with the smallest thing they could use, which was an 8, which they also call double 8, which takes a 16 millimeter film, and you expose one half, then you flip it and you expose the other half, and then you split the film, reverse one, click them together. You got, double the length of your film canister. So he did consult with them on the type of camera bodies to use, and particularly the lenses. He was a Zeiss guy. Every time he makes a movie, he only uses Zeiss lenses. And he also uses extremely wide angle lenses. So some of his favorite techniques, most directors have a signature. I don't know if you guys know this, but like, what's his name? The guy who directed Thriller and the Blues Brothers, John Landis.
John Landis, yeah.
His signature is "See you next Wednesday." So the next time you watch one of his movies, look for "See you next Wednesday." You'll see it spoken, or you'll see it spoken. You'll hear it spoken or see it written somewhere, like in Werewolves of London.
Yeah.
The movie that his friend is watching is the pornographic film called "See You Next Wednesday." Kubrick's signature was, particularly when he moved to color, was vibrant color. But even before that, he was famous for very, very long moving shots where the camera continues to move throughout the shot, and the entire scene happens while the camera moves.
Mm-hmm.
And the camera doesn't stop moving until it edits to the next scene, which is, like you brought it up a few minutes ago, the famous jump cut with the bone. That's called a jump cut. You don't. When I took video as my major in film or in school, and some film classes before that, so I know about the construction of movies and TV shows. You don't cut while you're moving the camera. You stop the camera move, and then you make your edit for the next scene. And he was famous for that, but also his very, very wide shots. So this is what he did: is he consulted them on how to make beautiful pictures with Zeiss lenses. And I don't remember which kind of camera he told them to use, but I think it was a Bell and Howell that that NASA went with on his recommendation. And that's his involvement with the space thing, period.
Well, no, actually, NASA did consult with him quite a bit on the making of 2001. And it was weird, too, because I did find some reference to how, like, NASA decided to become involved with the movie because they were curious to see how, like, essentially the cameras they were developing would be used for cinematic purposes or something like that. It was just a really weird reason that they cited for it. But yeah, no, there definitely was a lot of connections between Kubrick and NASA during the making of 2001. But I think the thing that people kind of forget about this is Kubrick consulted with experts on the topic of every movie that he was involved in. I mean, for instance, with his Napoleon film that was never brought to fruition, he actually hired one of the leading Napoleonic scholars in Europe and a whole staff of grad students to work with him and just compiling historical material for this. I mean, he hired people to go all over Europe searching for clothing that would have been worn during the Napoleonic years, weapons that would have been used, just all this other kind of stuff. I mean, so he had specialists who could identify authentic materials working for him, just all this other kind of crazy stuff. Mm-hmm. With Dr. Strangelove, he consulted with several of these big think tanks, a lot of other people that were tied into the defense industry. And again, these are just the people that we know officially that he consulted with. So Kubrick was, with the way he made his films, he was really obsessed with expertise, with trying to get things to be as accurate from a technical standpoint as he possibly could. So that's another reason why Bill Kaysing had originally focused on 2001, because it was acknowledged from pretty much the beginning that NASA was working with him on that picture. Mm-hmm. But see, where this gets like really interesting is Kaysing was really close to Mae Brussel, the really famous radio personality. She was one of the earliest sort of conspiracy radio titans, though certainly she was much more left-wing than some of the later manifestations like Bill Cooper, Alex Jones. But Mae Brussel was great. She knew Bill Kaysing. Kaysing actually lived close to her in Carmel, California, and he would go on her radio show periodically. And indeed, he did go on there and hosted it a few times as well. And he certainly spoke about the moon landing, and he spoke about Kubrick's possible role in it. So what's really interesting about this is that Mae Brussel really got her start on radio thanks to Paul Krasner, the longtime editor of The Realist. Krasner is a really fascinating guy. He turns up in just so much stuff. He was a co-founder of the Yippies. He knew Robert Anton Wilson and all these big Discordian people. He worked for Larry Flint for a time. And he did a lot of parapolitical research. In fact, I would kind of argue some of his on-the-ground research in the Manson killings is still some of the best that's out there right now. And he had originally gravitated towards Mae Brussel because of her research with JFK. And that was what had spurred him initially to help get her on the air. So why this is interesting is because Stanley Kubrick was a huge fan of The Realist. He had actually been a subscriber of The Realist since the late 1950s when the magazine was first launched. So he was a longtime reader of that. And what's more, The Realist is really where the sense of humor that's prevalent throughout Dr. Strangelove came from. In fact, as I understand it, Kubrick had originally wanted to hire Lenny Bruce, the famous comedian, to work on the screenplay with him. But Bruce had passed, so that was when he brought in Terry Southern, and Terry Southern was another guy who was plugged into that circle in The Realist. So The Realist was a really avant-garde underground publication, and especially when it started in the late 1950s, it probably didn't have more than a few hundred readers. And Paul Krasner basically ran all this stuff. So I got to think that there was a very, very good chance that Paul Krasner was aware at a minimum that Stanley Kubrick was a reader of The Realist. And certainly if he wasn't aware of this through the subscribers things, assuming Kubrick maybe used a false name or something, I think there's a good chance he would have at least found out later from Terry Southern. Because again, Southern worked with Kubrick on Dr. Strangelove. Southern was a real good friend of Krasner for years and so on and so forth. So it's real interesting that it's Mae Brussel's show where this connection of Stanley Kubrick with the moon landing really starts to take off, because this is what really gave Kaysing a platform to promote these ideals. And this is where I kind of get into some of these discussions about, how Kubrick might have influenced conspiracy culture more than people are aware of, because I think Kubrick would have been just egotistical.
He was conspiratorial. I'm not conspiratorial, but he was certainly controversial throughout his career and his life. I mean, we've said it enough, but he's talked about. I mean, how long has he been dead, and we're still talking about him? I mean,
But see, here's the thing, though. I think Kubrick, let's just say hypothetically, he maybe even had, communicated with Paul Krasner. I think he would have been just egotistical enough to nudge Paul and say, hey, why don't you guys start talking about the moon landing and me being involved in it on Mae Brussels' show? I really think that is something that we got to start considering. That Kubrick himself was a guy who was really perpetuating this own mythos around him. I mean, really, the whole basis for a lot of people in Kubrick faking the moon landing resides in The Shining, which is the movie that he would have been making right around the time when Casing is going on to Mae Brussels' show talking about all this stuff. So, given the timing of all this stuff, I really think that people need to consider this seriously, that Stanley Kubrick himself was actually the one who wanted people to consider him as the architect of the moon landing hoax. Because Kubrick, he wanted to be perceived as something other than just an average director. A Stanley Kubrick film just wasn't a movie. It was an event. It was something that you were supposed to tell your kids where you were when you went and saw it.
He's trying to drum up free advertising for himself.
Well, it's not just free advertising. He's trying to elevate himself above the pack.
Yeah.
Steven Spielberg's a director. Stanley Kubrick is the guy that NASA brings in to fake the moon landing. You know what I'm saying?
This realist is pretty wild. Softcore pornography of the month, grand old party. Session with Young Republic. What am I?
Krasner was involved in softcore porn throughout his whole career too, which again that brings up a lot of interesting questions. This is like another thing I get into a lot with the book. I mean, the whole thing with like Manson killings, because Krasner was one of the guys who did a lot of research in this, and Krasner was one of the guys that was really pushing the notion that the killings were partly inspired by these pornographic films that Roman Polanski was making that involved him, Sharon Tate, a lot of other Hollywood stars and what have you. And the thing is, Kubrick knew Polanski. They were good buddies. In fact, Polanski was invited over to Kubrick's manor to screen The Fearless Vampire Killers for him in '66 or so. And Polanski had actually invited Kubrick to go to his wedding bash, bachelor party, or whatever it was, at the Playboy Club shortly before he married Sharon Tate. So, he was sort of on the periphery of all of this. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of another interesting thing when you sort of look at the role, especially like with Lolita and the whole indications of that, of like these pornographic films involving minors with the Claire Quilty character and all this other stuff. So it's kind of another thing, when I kind of get into the darkness, I feel that Kubrick had intersected with some of these circles in Hollywood like Polanski and had seen what went on in them. Mm-hmm. And he rejected it, but it was hard for him to do that. And that was something that he had to struggle with throughout his life.
Spooks and pedophiles, whole section. And definitely, we know that stuff goes on with all the controversy we see lately with music singers and craziness, and it's just sick and twisted and continues to this day. And on so many different levels. I know I saw that Ridley Scott Napoleon, and I mean, it was okay, but I don't think I'd ever watch it again. It was kind of rough to watch, and I love Joaquin Phoenix, but that was a rough watch at a lot of levels. I don't know if you've seen that Napoleon yet by Ridley Scott, but I'd watch it. I wouldn't watch it again.
No, I have not seen it yet. Apparently, they were trying to do Kubrick's version of Napoleon as a mini series, I think. Which, if it ever gets made, it'll be really interesting if they follow the screenplay. I mean, I know he apparently had some like epic orgy sequence that he had written in the screenplay involving Napoleon that was always a bit of a question how they would have filmed that. But this would have been back in the 70s too, so like who knows? But One thing I'll tell you, though, kind of getting back to some of the darkness in his career as well, that I think is worth mentioning that not a lot of people are aware of, is the whole situation with James B. Harris and Sue Loines on Lolita. So James B. Harris was Kubrick's production partner in a lot of his early films. He was the producer of The Killing, Lolita. He had started working on Dr. Strangelove with Kubrick as well until they had dissolved their partnership. So with Lolita, Harris had embarked upon a relationship with the star of the film, Sue Loin. At the time when the relationship began, Sue Loin was 15 years old and James B. Harris was 39 years old. And he kept at this for several years after the film had wrapped as well. So it was really creepy, especially because this was more or less openly acknowledged in Hollywood. I mean, a lot of the gossip columns were salivating over this middle-aged man carrying on a relationship with an impressionable teenage girl. And again, this is something that I also think had really affected Kubrick, because this would have been roughly right around the same time that he had had his two daughters. I think both of them had been born by 1960, which was around the time that he was making Lolita. And certainly, this is a dark film, essentially dealing with two rival pedophiles. As I had indicated before, you can almost look at the Carol Quigley character, who's played by Peter Sellers, as almost, a Polanski-esque figure. I mean, he's this playwright, he's this filmmaker. At the end of the movie, it's revealed that Lolita had broken off her relationship with Quilty because he had tried to get her to make a quote-unquote art movie with some bodybuilders and stuff. That would have been a nice way of saying a pornographic picture in this particular era. And the whole thing with Sue Loin is absolutely nuts as well, because growing up, she was a very close friend of Michelle Phillips, who subsequently became a member of the Mamas and the Papas, John Phillips' wife, and also Tamara Hodel. Tamara Hodel was the daughter of George Hodel, who is a popular suspect for the Black Dahlia murderer. George Hodel was also brought to trial in 1950 for sexually assaulting Tamar. He prevailed in the legal proceedings with that, though there is a lot of controversy about how the prosecution handled Sue Loins. And Hodel did subsequently flee to the Philippines not long afterwards, and his daughter has steadfastly insisted that she was raped by her father for years afterwards, and also with some of the stuff tied to the Black Dahlia murder as well. So this is just like another really insane thing about this, because Michelle Phillips and her husband, John Phillips, were really closely connected later on to Polanski. In fact, they were also said to have been some of the members who were filmed in these pornographic tapes that Roman Polanski was making that kind of served as the backdrop to the Manson killings. So, again, this is sort of the periphery that Kubrick was existing on in Hollywood with a lot of these suspect characters. And you just see some of this stuff playing out. His production partner essentially carrying on a relationship with a teenage girl, which... Again, I don't want to libel myself here, but let's just say, like, afterwards, when Sue Loin died and Michelle Phillips, who was aware of all this, commented on it, she was pretty steadfast in insisting that this relationship had ruined Sue Loin's life. So how consensual it was when it began was highly debatable, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, if this were to happen today, the consensual part would probably be taken out of it. Most statutory laws in the country are the youngest for giving sexual okay, or giving the okay for sex, is 16 years old.
Yeah.
And so he would most definitely have gone to jail. I mean, he think what happened to, was it Jeffrey Weinstein and other things in Hollywood have gone. He would have a whole different story if that had happened, yesterday.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just a horrendous thing. And I mean, again, this is on top of Polanski. I mean, later on, this is a guy who's convicted of raping a 14-year-old girl. So there was some real decadence to some of these circles in Hollywood in the 1960s. And again, I have always felt that the Manson killings, and especially a lot of these rumors of these sex tapes, were really closely tied to that. And this is just another aspect of Kubrick that I think has just been totally ignored by so many people. And I get that, this is a very, very dark subject. I mean, it raises a lot of troubling questions about Kubrick. This is one of the things I had to struggle with in writing this book. After a lot of reflection on it, I really felt strongly that Kubrick would not have assaulted his daughters or anything of that nature. And again, I really feel strongly that his actions in the 60s, especially relocating from Hollywood to an isolated country manor in the UK, were probably in no small driven by some of the stuff that he had witnessed in the aftermath of the relationship that his production partner had with Sue Loin. I can't help but feel that after he became a father, he very strongly did not want his daughters to end up in a situation like Sue Loin was in.
Yep. And we should probably start closing out. It's always a pleasure. Your third time, the trilogy. Hopefully you can get a quadruple in at some point. And if you can, where's the best place to get your book, or any links and things like that?
Well, definitely Amazon. If you want your physical copies, head on over there now. We also have the PDF, which is a version available at the Farm's official store, which you can find a link to on my website. That is my old blog, ViseUp. So for that, it is VISUPVIEW, ViseUpView. It's all one word, .blogspot.com. You head on over there to see the links for the physical book, for the digital version, all that other good stuff. And as always, I am the host of the Farm Podcast. Got a free weekly episode that comes out every Monday that's available on Apple, Spotify, all the other big podcast platforms. And also we've got the Patreon, where you get 2 additional shows per month on the lowest tier and a lot of other goodies on the upper tiers. So check all that stuff out. But I really hope some people will be convinced from this to read the Kubrick book. It was really a labor of love on my point. It was great just actually to write a book about somebody that I actually admired, as opposed to, say, Edward Lansdale or some other psychopath like that. That's another reason why I want this to be successful. I'd like to prove to myself I could write a book about somebody I respect and actually make something off of it.
Well, it's always a pleasure. We appreciate it so much, and keep us in the loop on future things. And we always enjoy it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, man,
Thank
definitely.
you guys
Thanks.
for having
Great
me.
show.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
All right. Good luck, and hopefully we gave you a little bit of pee time before your next show. Take care.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Have a good
Take
one.
care. Bye-bye. All right, everybody. You're listening to Church of Mabus Radio, United Public Radio, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. I got so sick of messing with the site lately, I just directed it to the network site. So the main Church of Mabus Radio right now just goes to the UPRN site. So just be done with it. And then basically what's coming up next week, Afterlife. And then to see what else is going on. Mark Eddy's been helping me schedule a lot. So there's someone we're trying to work on about the Ohio serpent mounds and things like that.
Oh, yeah, cool.
And let's see what's coming up here. I have to look again. Oh, I have it right here on my computer. Hold on.
The next, well, where are we now? We're
Ryan M. Bowden, and then Aaron D. Nancy
Thames.
Off on July 5th. I'll remind Michelle about that. And then Susan Basile, and then Barbara DeLong. She wrote a book on Roswell. She's been on before. She's coming back on. And then I'm working on the rest. I'm working on the rest slowly but surely. So what's going on? What do you think they're going to do to Trumpelgooch with sentencing? They're not going to do anything. They can't put him
in prison because he's going to have his Secret Service entourage. I mean, how do you put Trump plus his security team in a federal prison? Going to be something. But also, Biden said, and even though I read a brief article before the show started, Biden said if he loses, he's going to pardon him anyway. So I don't think anything's going to happen one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, what are they gonna do? I mean, they can't
Yeah.
send him to jail.
Biden literally said he would pardon Trump if he loses this trial, which he did.
Yeah, why would Biden do that though? Just so he can.
He's demented. I don't know. He said it. Whether he does it or not is another thing. But he did say he was going to.
I saw the craziest video of Biden of him farting at a Democratic party.
Yeah.
Did you see that? He saluted after it.
Mm-hmm.
You saw that? That was real. My God, both sides are just like pee-pee diapers. I don't like none of them. They're both just make me want to throw up. I've been thinking about burning my ballot live on the show or on Facebook. Like I'm just sad. I don't even like our government. I just don't feel anything for them. They don't do anything for me. Trump or Biden don't know I exist. They don't give a crap about me. So who cares? And I'll kiss my grits. I don't like any of them. But our government's an a-hole. The way they talk about, I mean, how many people have suffered from UFO stuff and have PTSD from weird stuff, and they can't even be honest. They keep just, we're going to have some congressional hearings. We're going to release some videos from the Pentagon. There is no alien life next to the Pentagon. Why don't you just all kiss my ass, quite frankly? That's what I feel like. Get a plunger if you like. The other person that gets on my nerves lately is Putin.
Oh, yeah.
You're a little schmuck. Like an albino Kim Jong from Korea.
Yeah.
It's like, will you just do it? Just hit it. Do it, you little prick. I'm tired of hearing it. Just end it.
I mean, does he actually have the balls to push the button? I don't think he does. I mean, he hasn't yet.
He just sounds like a little boy cried wolf at this point. Like, are you going to do it or not? You threatened it 1,000 times. Shut up.
Let's see it.
You little Gollum. Please, anybody drops a nuke, we're just all going to die at once. Like,
I am curious. I wonder if he does launch a missile, wherever he goes, will Elon Musk stay true to his word and launch one of his satellites into its path and stop it? I mean, imagine being like the leader of this, let's just say the second or third largest country in the world, or most powerful anyway, launches a missile attack on somebody and it's foiled by some civilian's satellite. The embarrassment. There's no coming back from that.
Yeah, just seems like all our leaders suck. But I saw something with Putin. Something about, and this is a real story, he was blocking all the GPS of airplanes over Europe, like somehow interfering with all the GPS on airplanes over Europe on purpose. So they would like have mayhem. That's like something out of James Bond.
Well, thank God they also have redundant systems. They're all planes, well, most big planes, commercial planes and jets have radar and stuff that they can fly by. Well, not by wire anymore if they turn the network off, but they can fly by instrument and they can fly by eye. They can see. So it still makes it more dangerous, but
I ain't gonna do it. Just go ahead and do it. I'm tired of bills. I don't want us to all be. I don't want us. The societal structures of our country and with money, it's the most stressful thing ever. I'm going through considerably financial stress from my job, acting like an idiot, making cuts and doing weird things all the time and empty promises. So
we got lucky. My girlfriend found a letter that I had put away somewhere and forgot to open. That was 2 years ago, a year ago. No, 2 years. It was just for 2022. 2 years ago, I overpaid taxes in the state of Maryland. They were still my job was taking out tax money for Maryland, but not for Pennsylvania. Even after I changed my address, they forgot to start doing Pennsylvania. So they sent me a check for $1,500 that I had paid in taxes. So we got $1,589 put in the bank today. So, woo! A lot of bills are going to get paid with that.
That's good. And, everything's just crazy and feels crazy every day. Eventually, something's going to give with Taiwan or something, and then there may be World War III. It's already pretty much happening anyway.
But we got 2 wars going on right now. Any one of them could spark into a third world war. We got China rattling its saber at Taiwan. We've got Kim Jong-un rattling its saber at South Korea. The whole planet is in a frenzy right now.
Just idiots.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like just better off and just go ahead and get dying over with at this point. My God.
Yeah.
It's like, just go ahead and do it. Gonna do it anyway. It's like an appointment. You know it's there. You might as well just get to it and get it over with. That's what it feels like.
Get there early so you can fill out the paperwork.
Yeah. Get shuffled off to the next babysitting planet.
Yep.
Yeah. Earth's going to 5D supposedly. Yeah. Believe that when I see it. But you know, we've had some good shows. Wally Wagner, that was interesting. UFOs in the Bible. Then I asked him some tough questions about Jesus. That was really good.
Cool.
And that was interesting because he was a postman and had a Tic Tac UFO sighting as a postman.
Wow.
And then he went back to work and didn't tell anyone at all because he didn't know what to say, but then told friends and stuff. But can you imagine being a postman and just seeing that? You're doing the mail and there's suddenly
they're out every day, especially if he was one of those, you know, walking mail guys. You know, if you're out every day, 360 or however many days a year they deliver mail. So in some places they deliver mail on Sunday now. So, yeah, think about it. Think about how many park rangers might have seen UFOs because they're outside all the time.
And they know all kinds of stuff too with Bigfoot. Yeah. I've heard they have to report Bigfoot to like a certain agency. I've heard that too when it happens.
Oh wow, I hadn't heard that one.
Some type of different situation. I saw a documentary about that. Some Canadian Mountie story about them having to report Bigfoot to another agency when it happens. But anywho, it's been a great show, and we'll see you next Friday. Thanks everybody. This is United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans, nighty night. Have a good weekend, everybody. Take care. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Steven. Thanks, JoJo. Thanks, Christina. Thanks, the world. And Putin.
And thanks to your 4 new kitty cats.
Yep. And Putin, kiss my grits. All right. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.